Hey guys, in this video we're going to be building a really easy end table using only 5 beginners tools, and I've added a link in the description to the free plans that you can download and follow along with at home. This video follows on from another that I did that talks you through my thoughts on the first 5 tools you need to get started in woodworking. If you haven't watched that video yet, I'll add the link in the description so that you can go and watch it after you finish this one. Right, in order to build this table you'll want to buy yourself some pre-planed timber, also known as PSE, plain square edge, or S4S, surface 4 sides. All the materials are in a comprehensive list within the free plans, so I won't go over them again here, but I'll just refer to them as their parts, which will be the 4 top stretchers, the 4 bottom stretchers, 4 legs and 4 boards to make the top. The first thing you're going to want to do is to take your circular saw and speed square and trim the scruffy end off each one of your boards to give you a neat end to start with. Then you'll want to measure out 328mm or 13 inches long on one of your 18 by 44mm or 3/4 by 2 inch boards to cut your first top stretcher. You'll be cutting it in the same way that you trim the ends, just using your circular saw and speed square. The way I do this is I mark my measurement, draw a line, and then line up the notch on my saw with the pencil line and place my speed square against the edge of the saw's base plate. This just ensures that the cut remains straight throughout. It's worth noting that as I'm doing this on my workbench, I've raised the workpiece up under some old 1x4, which not only provides room for the blade, but also supports the workpiece and stops it from binding on the blade, which can cause kickback. I've also made sure that the depth of the blade is set to only a little lower than the piece I'm cutting. That way I won't end up cutting into my workbench. You won't want to mark out all the pieces ahead of time, as you'll need to account for the thickness of the saw blade, which is known as the kerf. The best method is to simply measure out each piece as you go along after making the previous cut. Measure, mark, cut. Measure, mark, cut. And keep going until you have all 4 stretchers. The stretchers are essentially pieces of wood that will join the legs together and provide stability. I find it useful to go ahead and label the pieces as I've cut them so I don't end up making any silly mistakes. Then we need to cut the bottom stretchers from the 2x2 or the 44mm by 44mm board. We'll need 4 of these at exactly the same measurement as your top stretchers, so I'm cutting them at 328mm or 13 inches again. Remember, measure, mark, cut, and you won't go wrong. If you're doing this on a miter saw, then you can set up a stop block to make the repeatable cuts. Once you've got your 4 bottom stretchers, be sure to label them as well. Next up, you'll need to cut 4 legs at 550mm or 22 inches long from the rest of your 2x2 boards in exactly the same way as you did the stretchers. I told you this project was simple. It's just a case of measuring, marking and cutting again until you have all 4 legs. Label them again and then it's onto the boards for the top. For the top you'll want each piece at roughly 500mm or 20 inches, and yep, you've guessed it, it's once again a case of measure, mark and cut until you've got all 4 pieces needed. I had a bit more wood at the end of my 4th board, but I didn't bother cutting it off as it will be cut off further down the line. But you do you and cut it off or leave it if you prefer. We'll be trimming it across all 4 sides a bit further down the line anyway, so don't worry too much at this stage, as long as you've got enough wood to work with. That's all the cutting done for now. The next step is drilling all the pocket holes we need. First off, you'll want to check your particular jig and adjust it accordingly. Mine's the Kreg 320, so I took the middle section out, adjusted the sliders to 19mm in my case, and then I checked that the drill collar was also set to 19mm. Here's a little tip for you. If you're ever unsure what screws to use for your pocket hole projects, just Google Kreg Find My Screw and you'll find a really useful page on the Kreg Tool website that'll help you select the right screws for the job. So we're going to be drilling 2 pocket holes in the end of each of our stretchers on the same side. I'm doing this strictly according to the 5 tools video that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, so I'm not using clamps and I'm just holding the pocket hole jig to the workpiece with my hands. It's definitely easier to do this with clamps, and I know a lot of jigs have built-in clamps which should make life easier. However, I just applied plenty of downward pressure on my jig and didn't have any problems, so it's definitely doable. At this stage you want to think about the sides of the wood that will be on show and ensure that you drill the pocket holes on the ugliest side of the wood, as this side will be hidden from view. You're drilling 2 at one end and 2 at the other end of each of the top and bottom stretchers. Once you've done them, your stretchers should all look like this. When you've finished your stretchers, you'll want to move on to the tabletop. I split my jig out to a single drill guide, just follow whatever works for your particular jig. Again, I'm looking at my boards and choosing the best side to be on show at the top. I can then drill my pocket holes in the less attractive side. I'm doing pocket holes for the top as it means I can use them as a clamp, and also means I can carry on working on the project while the glue dries, as the screws will hold it in place. I went with 3 pocket holes along the edge and made sure that I didn't drill the outside ones too close to the edges, as I'll be cutting these down to size later on and I don't want them in the way. I've got 4 boards, but only need to drill pocket holes on 3 edges, as the rest will be the outside edges, so be sure not to get carried away with your drilling. I labelled the boards so I know which order I place them in, and I can easily reference this when it comes to assembly. I like to sand all my pieces now, as it's much simpler to do at this stage compared to when it's all assembled. Depending on how rough your wood is, you'll need to take a view on what grit to use, but for pre-planed timber like this that will be painted, I tend to find something like 120 grit will be just fine. I didn't bother sanding the boards for the top at this stage though, as I'll be doing a more detailed sanding of these when the top is all assembled. Once you've done the random orbital sanding, take a piece of sandpaper and wrap it round a scrap block of wood, and then run over the edges of the pieces just to soften the sharp edges and make it nicer to touch. Right, on to assembly for the frame. I like to recess the top stretchers slightly just to give a nicer aesthetic. The distance you set it back is entirely up to you, but you'll want something to shim it up to the space you want. You can do this with pretty much anything, from a scrap of plywood through to a piece of an old Amazon box. My go-to method is to use a pack of playing cards. I can then just count out how many cards I want to make my gap. On this one, I'm using 15 cards. Make sure your pocket holes are on the inside of your piece so they won't show when it's all assembled. Firstly, I put my driver into my drill bit and set the clutch to 8 to make sure I don't overdrive the screws. If this is your first project, then you might be surprised at the use of glue, but wood glue is an essential element of furniture projects and is used on pretty much everything you make in woodworking. The screws add strength and clamping pressure. Make sure you add some glue to the end of your board, and then if you already have some clamps, I'd recommend using them here, but if you don't, just make sure that you've got it held nice and tight and drive your screws in, being careful not to go too fast or to overdrive your screws. You just need to drive them in tightly enough to pull everything together for a nice snug fit. And you'll see that because we've used the playing cards, it ends up showing a nice little detail, setting the stretcher back from the legs. I tend to do 2 sides and then join these sides together, but do whatever feels right for you. For me, I'll be adding the top and bottom stretchers to a side, then doing another side, and finally joining those 2 sides together. I measured up 70mm, which is around 2 3/4 inches, from the bottom, and cut a couple of scraps of 2x2 to use as visual markers, rather than keep measuring. You can use these blocks to locate the bottom stretchers at the same point around your legs, or you can just measure it up. Make sure you locate the bottom stretchers with the pocket holes facing the feet to ensure they won't be visible when the table is fully built and upright. Again, you'll want to apply the glue and then the screws as well. Once these stretchers are secured, you'll have your first leg section complete. It's then just a case of repeating this process again so you have a matching pair. Next, you need to join these 2 leg sections together with more top and bottom stretchers. I attached them to the one section first and essentially just did it the same way as I did before, using the playing cards as a spacer and then gluing and screwing the top stretcher. Then I lined up the bottom stretcher with the existing one and glued and screwed that into place as well. I did the same on the other side, then added glue to the ends of all 4 stretchers and attached them to my other leg section in the same way as before, but just a little bit more stress due to lining up of all 4 stretchers with glue on all at the same time. Fortunately, it all went smoothly, and now I've got a full leg assembly complete. It should look like this. At this stage, I'm going to drill a couple of holes for the screws to hold the tabletop on. The best way to do this is to drill a hole slightly larger than the actual screw, as this will allow a bit of room for wood movement. It's unlikely you'll get a lot, as this isn't a large table, but it's worth doing just to give that little bit of space. I've also drilled a wider, shallow hole to recess the screw head into. It's not totally necessary, but just gives a better look. I tested it against a scrap of the board I'm using for the top to make sure I wasn't going too deep with the holes, as it would be heartbreaking to do all this work only to finish by screwing straight through your top. So I'd recommend you do the same. I'm doing 2 holes on the left stretcher and then 2 on the right stretcher, which will be plenty to hold it in place, and it means I can line up the top with the grain direction, which again should minimise issues with wood movement. Just make sure that you're drilling your holes far enough in that they won't interfere with the pocket holes. At this stage, I added a slight chamfer to the bottom of the legs with some sandpaper, just to help the wood avoid splitting when moving the table around. Simply use some sandpaper around a scrap of wood and sand it at an angle around all 4 feet. Next up, we're going to assemble the boards for the top. I lined them up in order based on my labels and then stood the first one on its side and applied a healthy amount of glue. Then I spread it around for an even coverage. Then I laid it next to the next board and screwed it in place with the pocket holes. I continued this until all 4 boards were joined together. Now I've joined the boards for the top, I wanted to give it a good sanding. I like to mark the panel with pencil so that I can see where I've sanded and ensure that I cover any high or low points from where I join the boards together. It's worth starting at a lower grit here and then working your way up. I started at 80 just to get the rough stuff off and then moved up to 120. Once the panel was sanded, it was time to cut it down to size. I cut about 20mm, roughly 3/4 of an inch off one end. As I was using a circular saw and a speed square, I ran the first part of my cut from one end and then roughly halfway through I stopped the saw, backed it off slightly and then swapped the square over to the other end and continued with my cut. My saw starts up quite aggressively, so I'd recommend always backing out the cut slightly before starting it back up again to make sure you don't get kickback and to make sure it doesn't jump and ruin your cut. And then measured out from my freshly cut end to get my 465mm or 18 inches and cut this side too. Then I flipped the board around and cut the other sides parallel and at the correct measurements to give me the perfectly square panel to use as my tabletop. Once the top was cut, I eased over the sharp edges with my trusty sandpaper wrapped around a block of wood. Next up is paint. I don't know if you've seen painter's points before, but they're essentially just these little pyramids that you can stand your project on, meaning they won't stick to your workbench or make a mess and you can get to the very edges of your piece. I don't have any, so I made some using little blocks of wood and hammering a nail through the middle. They work great for now. As I'm painting my base, I started out with a primer and made sure to pay special attention to the knots in the wood, as they can leak through your paint if you don't seal them properly. I'm using Zinsser BIN Primer Sealer, which does a great job at this, and I'll link to it in the description. Once the first coat of primer is dry, I run over it with a very light pass of 120 grit sandpaper, just using my hand, and then wiped it down to get rid of any dust. I applied 2 coats of primer, and then while that was drying, I moved on to the top. For this one, I'm using a Georgian Oak Danish oil, but feel free to stain or finish it however you see fit. I like Danish oil as it's easy to apply and is hard wearing enough for this application. Personally, I also like the Georgian Oak colour as it darkens the pine to a more appealing colour. Depending on what you use here, you'll likely need to do at least a couple of coats and will need to lightly denib with sandpaper between coats. I needed to do 3 coats, but just be sure to check the instructions on the tin. I tend to do the underside first and then prop it on some painter's points or a scrap of wood just to hold it off the surface while I do the top side and the edges. I could then add the top coat of paint. I've got this leftover tin of Farrow & Ball Old White, so I'm using it up. I applied 3 coats in total, just using a brush and leaving it to dry between coats. Once it's all dry, all that's left is to attach the tabletop to the legs. I use 63mm or 2.5 inch pocket hole screws as they already have a washer built into them, and I already had some to hand, but you could always add a washer to a normal screw if you prefer. Just be very careful to measure out the screw first so you don't screw straight through your brand new tabletop. And there it is, a finished side table using only 5 tools, and it didn't take weeks to make. And now you've got somewhere to store your tools. There's loads of ways you can take these basic plans and add your own touch or different features to it. For example, you could swap out the wood on the top or the legs for a nicer hardwood such as oak. You could stain and oil the legs instead of painting them. You could cut a shelf to sit on the bottom stretchers. You could add a drawer, or even go as far as enclosing the entire unit and turning it into a bedside cabinet. If you do build this project or do your own customized version, I'd love to see photos, so be sure to email them through to me or tag me on social media. All the links will be in the description. I've made sure to link to the items, plans and relevant videos in the description, so please check them out, and I've linked to a video here that I think you'll like to watch next. See you next time.